We'll just give it a few more seconds. Okay, so I think that based on the panel, the results we had from the poll, we had limited financial resources, political buy-in were probably the two top runners that I would have seen on the poll. And what I definitely would like our panelists to do is now give us some updates on the governance frameworks they've been involved in and the extent to which they see some of the issues raised by the audience as being challenges or maybe opportunities in terms of enhancing water governance in the region. I'd first like to ask Kareem to share with us some thoughts on the work that CARICOM has been doing and also the current status of some of the work that the Secretariat has been working on along with other countries in the region. Kareem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. And good morning, everybody. Let me start by expressing my gratitude to the government of Barbados and to USAID and all the partners that brought this to fruition. I don't see the slides. I got a question? But what I want to bring to you in any case is an update of the CARICOM water framework, the Common Water Framework. But first, what I wanted to do is just bring a broader perspective of the decision-making and the governance aspects of CARICOM as a whole, and a bit on the functions of the Secretariat as well. And then we get into some of the more specific water decisions and water initiatives that have been cooking for some time, unfortunately. So CARICOM is 15 member states, 5 associate members, 50 years this year, from 1973. 16 million people to provide water for, more importantly. A quick look at the decision-making process. But before we get to that, look at this painting. 10 seconds in AI, a depiction of a CARICOM heads of government meeting. What a time to be alive. So that was nice. It has some introduction. So all the graphics in here are generated by AI, so you got to make good use of them. So the chief decision making in CARICOM is through the heads of government conference. And second to that is the Community Council of Ambassadors. So below that, we have 4 functional councils of ministers to support the heads of government. The one that will be most pertinent here is the Council of Trade and Economic Development. So under Article 15, the Trade and Economic Development basically supports trade, competitiveness, but more importantly here, it also speaks to the protection of the natural resource base in our member states that supports trade and economic development. So the protection of water, the protection of land, oceans, seas, and the sustainable use of those in order to increase our resilience, increase our competitiveness, and increase our level of integration and intra-regional trade. What I also want to bring though is COFCOR, which is the Council for Foreign and Community Relations. So a lot of environmental matters are dealt with globally at the UN level. So it is also important to be familiar with this level of decision making as well among foreign ministers. So things like the SDGs, things like water, climate change, oceans, often have decision making processes at the level of foreign ministers and through the permanent caucus of, or the caucus of permanent missions to the UN in New York. So just a bit on the Secretariat. The Secretariat is the main administrative organ. So the CARICOM is not just the Secretariat. CARICOM is first and foremost the member states and their citizens. The CARICOM Secretariat administering the function of the organs and the councils of ministers, as well as the regional technical institutions. Many of them are here, SEDIMA, 5C, CAMH, etc., and that the Prime Minister mentioned this morning that are so crucial to water management in the community. So Article 58, just quickly going through the basis in the treaty itself. Article 58, the first article, the first para speaks to the sound management of natural resources to support the transformation and sustainable development broadly, and then specifically for the agriculture sector. Again, the Prime Minister spoke so much about the importance of agriculture and trade and the impact that water has on that. And then the second paragraph is more broad, looking at biological diversity and other natural resources that need to be sustainably managed in order for the revised treaty implementation to work. So now next, I'm going to just turn to the key decisions, or some key decisions that occurred in various community councils, starting with the 25th special quartet. So quartet is the broad quartet is trade ministers, and then we have special meetings of quartet for environment minister, agriculture minister, energy, transport, etc., etc. But most of the decisions here would have been from environment ministers. So back in 2008, the ministers would have had a strong discussion and decision to reaffirm the commitment based on the SDGs, not the SDGs at that time, the Global Sustainable Development Agenda, the Mauritius Strategy, Johannesburg, Barbados POA, etc., to really implement integrated water resources management and water resource efficiency in the community as a key supporting function of development. In the same meeting as well is when we have the first decision on the Common Water Framework. So it says approve the process for the development of the Common Water Framework and urge it to be completed in the shortest possible time, which we did not do. But it also mandated, and the last point there, it also mandated, which is critical, the environment ministers urged ministers responsible for water, environment, agriculture, tourism, health in particular, to put on their highest agenda integrated water resources management. So this goes back to the message of partnerships that and integrated approaches that the Prime Minister spoke about this morning. So it also endorsed the consortium of CARICOM institutions for dealing with water, which is also what I will speak about at the end of the presentation as well. And it comprised the core reporting group, comprised the Secretariat, CARDI, and back then SEDIRA, SEDIMA now, SEHI, CARFA, 5C, CIMH, and the University of the West Indies to facilitate and coordinate this process of integrated water resources management in the region, and to collaborate in conducting the various studies in the region to bring that to fruition and to complete the Common Water Framework. So at that time and at this time, drought 2018, 2008, and 2010, drought in the region was particularly challenging for us. So I brought this joint meeting of health ministers and environment ministers as another example of coordination and governance and decision-making at the level of the community. So at that meeting, the terms of reference for the Consortium for Water has been approved, as well as encouraging and requesting the various studies and so on that would have been leading to the Common Water Framework. 2015 was another big year, but most of that meeting was focused on the groundbreaking work that CIMH was presenting at the time, the Global Framework of Climate Services, which would have supported water in a major way. So I just brought that as well as a key kind of milestone in the regional governance of water. More recently, last year, the 103rd special meeting of COTED acknowledged the Common Water Framework, the IWRM that Farzana will speak about, as well as the Common Environmental and Natural Resources Management Policy, which is a common public good, one of the common public goods that the revised Treaty of Shagarama speaks to. So going quickly, in 2017, we mobilized the funds through bilaterals to produce the technical consultation paper for the Common Water Framework.
Kareem, I'm going to have to stop you there. But we'll come back to
No problem.
the technical consultation paper. Just want to make sure that we have at least the introductory discussions.
Yes.
Then we'll come back, and then we'll also open up for the Q&A.
That's fine. That's fine.
Thank you so much. So I want to now invite Farzana, as you had a nice segue from Kareem in terms of talking about some of the work that's been under discussion at the level of the OACS and the ways in which you've been tackling issues of water governance. Thank you.
Testing. Great. Thank you so much. And it really is a pleasure to be here back in my birthplace, Barbados. It really is wonderful to be with you as well. Good morning, everyone. I am almost sure that most of you have heard the term IWRM before. Those who are physically here, those who are online, integrated water resources management. But in a very small nutshell, IWRM is the coordinated development and management of water, land, and related resources for social and economic welfare towards sustainable development in a very, very small nutshell. And we've been speaking about it for decades. I will go through a little history of IWRM and water-related discussions and papers, etc., within the past decade or decade and a half. Kareem has already spoken about the CARICOM Common Water Framework. That was in 2008. This action framework for integrated water resources management is basically, it falls under that umbrella of the Common Water Framework. And just to go on to 2006 and 2011, between that time frame, under the GEF-funded IWCAM project, there were IWRM plans and roadmaps that were developed for various countries. There was the review of legislation and policy. Moving quickly on to 2012, the Secretariat of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States developed a model water policy and legislation for member states that served as basically guidelines for the member states. And in 2018, Dr. Fletcher will speak more to this, but the Regional Strategic Action Plan for the water sector for the Caribbean region was presented at, I believe it was the 14th High Level Forum, and CWWA and its partners were given the mandate to develop an implementation plan, which has been done. And fast forward to now, the present time, between 2020 and 2023, we have developed a draft action framework for integrated water resources management for the CARICOM region. This is under the GEF-funded IWECO project, integrating land, water, land, and ecosystem services management for Caribbean small island developing states. The lead implementing agency is UNEP, and the co-executing agencies are the Cartagena Convention Secretariat and CARFA. And the OECS Commission, which I represent, is a lead technical partner in this. So Global Water Partnership Caribbean was contracted to develop this action framework for integrated water resources management for the region. And there was a lot of collaboration, I can say, in the development of this draft action plan. We tried to ensure that there was also the synergies between the RSAP and the IWRM framework were recognized. And the vision for this action framework really is a harmonized IWRM model that ensures water security for CARICOM SIDS. The mission really is to provide coordinated water governance through creating an enabling environment and sustainable development. The overarching goal for this as well is to do so through legislation, policy, capacity building towards sustainable development. This process took place between, well, the process for the draft action framework took place between 2021 and 2022. Note that I've said that it's still draft, and 6 strategic goals were developed. These 6 strategic goals sought to deal with or to address the challenges that we've seen in integrated water resources management. I would have said that we've discussed IWRM in the region for the past couple of decades. Yes. Is it working? It's a good question. And we can basically say, no, we're not really seeing it working. And we want to change that. So these 6 strategic goals seek to address those challenges. Strategic goal 1, you can see on the screen actually, I've indicated the 6 strategic goals for you to go through. And also at the bottom, please feel free to access the draft framework at the link that you see, because we really would like your review. Again, I reiterate, it's a draft document, and we are in the process of wider consultations, wider regional consultations, and finalization of the document. So the first strategic goal looks at improving capacities and frameworks for holistic, multi-sectoral and cross-cutting disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Multi-sectoral being one of the key words here, and cross-cutting. By the very nature of our small islands, we have interdependencies among sectors, yet I'm sure that we can all agree that we tend, unfortunately, to work in silos. So we are looking at improving capacities and frameworks towards having more coordination and collaboration. Second goal is encouraging coordination among key water stakeholders towards harmonization, communication, and community empowerment. We're looking at departing from the top-down approach and looking more at the bottom-up approach. Who's being impacted? Engage these persons in conversations, in planning. So certainly community empowerment is something that's very important here. Sustainable Goal 3 is looking at promoting knowledge-based participatory approaches, looking at traditional ecological knowledge, looking at nature-based solutions as well. We're seeing that it is working, and we need to continue along this route. Strategic Goal 4 is looking at guiding the development or strengthening of an independent, overarching water resources entity, whatever form it takes, whether it is one entity or if it is perhaps even resuscitating the CARICOM institution, the water institutions. So whatever form this takes. Strategic Goal 5 is to strategize the introduction of water information systems. Without data and information, how are we going to understand the trends within our own countries? How are we going to be able to make decisions? So of course, this is necessary towards water management and certainly integrated water resources management. And finally, to identify and facilitate the implementation of sustainable financing mechanisms. I recognize that in the poll, the lack of financial resources, this was one of the key things that was pointed out. So the 6th goal is hoping to address this. And I just also want to add that this is an action plan. It has a roadmap of action. So these strategic goals are further elaborated in specific activities, which you can review in the document. So, for example, sustainable financing mechanisms, if I can just add a
Rosanna,
few.
I hate
Or
to cut
maybe
you
not.
off, but we're going to need to give Jimmy a little time as well to
Sure.
build on it. But we will come back to some of those activities, and hopefully there'll be some pressing questions coming from the audience to allow you to explore a little bit more. But thank you so much. That was really very useful. And I see how we are trying to respond to some of the issues raised by the audience, and hopefully we've got some additional ideas in terms of how we can move forward. I did appreciate your honest feedback about the fact that we've got the plans, but we're not doing so well on the movement. Jimmy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. It's good also to see so many familiar faces in the audience. The Caribbean's water sector and the Regional Strategic Action Plan. This was something that we embarked on in 2018, and it was a very iterative process, very consultative process. Many of the people who were consulted are again in this room, the managers of the utility companies, development partners, and it allowed us to get a very good overview of what was taking place within the water sector and specifically drilling down to the water utilities, what was happening in those water utilities. Um, the challenges in the water sector, we all know. Legislation and governance. There is weak legislation, there are weak governance arrangements at the highest level, but also within the utility companies. Inadequate infrastructure. You heard Prime Minister Motley speak about that. Many of our countries have water infrastructure that was laid down over a century ago. The engineers who laid down that water infrastructure are no longer around. There are no plans to tell us where these pipes are running. So it's no wonder that you have issues of non-revenue water where we have leakages and people don't know where those leakages are because some of these leakages are taking place on the buildings, some of these are on the roads. And to replace that, that's why this whole issue of financing looms so large. The issue of sustainability of the resource because of climate change, but also because of things before climate change. And a very good friend of mine in this room, Keith Nichols, once said something to me that has been embedded in my mind from that point. He said, climate change is everything, but everything is not climate change. Now, as a climate change activist, I love when people blame everything on climate change because it means finally we're getting the message across that climate change is impacting every single facet of our life. But not everything that's happening around us is as a result of climate change. So when we engage in massive deforestation or when we clear hillsides to put houses with roofs that now concentrate that water and send it down in torrents as opposed to when that water was being captured and allowed to slowly percolate down into the ground. That's not climate change. That's poor land use. Those are poor policies. Um, so sustainability of the resource before climate change and after climate change, Prime Minister Motley spoke very eloquently about it. Evaporation as a result of warmer temperatures, sea level intrusion, which is causing salinization of groundwater sources, pollution from agriculture and other issues. Those are all issues that we have to deal with. So how do we address the sustainability of that resource that we have to manage? Population growth and urban development and also tourism. As populations grow, as we move into areas where people need to have running water, as the tourism industry expands, and I saw some statistics somewhere, I think that said the average tourist uses 3 times more water than the average citizen of a country. You can't tell a tourist coming to your country when you're promoting tourism that you could only bathe once a day, or that when you get out of the pool you can't wash yourself down. These are things that we have to cater for. Pollution from very many different sources, agriculture and otherwise chemicals, and then finally the climate crisis. I was a little depressed to hear that for the first time climate change and water featured in the deliberations of the UNFCCC, because really the issue that the sector that's being impacted most by climate change, particularly for us, is the water sector. You know, the work that Professor Hall has done at Mona is suggesting, and again, Prime Minister Motley, I should just really replay her speech for my presentation, but Prime Minister Motley spoke about a 20% reduction in precipitation. You know, those are all issues that we have to deal with. What climate change does to water infrastructure. Anytime there's a hurricane, people like my friend here, Christopher Husbands, who's managing a water utility, that hurricane devastates the water infrastructure. When I became Minister of Responsibility for Water and I spoke to the people at the water and sewage company in St. Lucia, they told me about lines that were suspended in the forest because they did not have the funding to relay those lines on the ground after those lines had been damaged by Hurricane Thomas. Those are things that our water utility managers deal with every single day. So what was the response? The response was the Regional Strategic Action Plan for Governance and Climate Resilience. And those of you who don't know, that's the John Compton Dam in Roseau in St. Lucia, which itself has been impacted by climate change. 1/3 of its capacity reduced as a result of siltation. The framework response, governance. We have to address the issues of governance at the level of the utility company, but also at the level of how do we manage the water sector from a regional perspective? And again, I endorse Prime Minister Motley's statement about making CIMH, which is already a CARICOM institution, giving it responsibility for the water sector, because we don't have a CARICOM institution with responsibility for water, and that has really bedeviled many of our efforts. We've tried the CWWA, Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association, which has done an excellent job every year with the high-level forum where it brings everybody together, all of the stakeholders, but that is not a CARICOM institution. So even to get the RSAP endorsed, we had to do it through a high-level forum, and CARICOM had to come in a kind of hybrid arrangement to make that happen. If this is done by CIMH, it removes all those problems. So governance issues, very important. Policies, removing the management of the water resource from the same ministry or the same agency that is using the resource is something I fought for when I was minister. You can't have a Ministry of Agriculture also responsible for managing the water resources agency when the agricultural sector is a major user of water. Or you can't locate the regulation of water in the same agency that manages the utility company. You have to separate it and ensure that there's arm's length regulation and also arm's length management of the resource. So that's very important. Um, Water and land use policies. A lot of the issues we have with water are caused by poor land use policies. We have a situation in St. Lucia in the dry season. There are 37 watersheds, but only 15 of them account for 99% of the stream flow during the dry season. Many of our watersheds are damaged, some to the point of no return as a result of poor land use policies. So in governance, we have to look at land use. Then the next issue is water resources management. Fazana spoke about that. We have to address this whole question of proper spatial planning and understanding that a watershed is not just a physical space, it's a political space, it's a social space, it's an environmental space. How do we manage watersheds? And how do we ensure that our development proceeds along a watershed plan? I think that is extremely important because water will be if it's not already, the biggest issue that we have to deal with. Things like reforestation, knowing what you're managing. When I was minister with responsibility for water, I could not tell you what that water asset was that I was managing. I did not know what it was. So again, managing, understanding water basin budgets. We do not have, in most of our countries, we do not have a water problem. We have a water storage problem. We have a water distribution problem. Our water balance sheet is good. Enough water falls during the course of the year with proper storage and proper distribution to deal with all of our water demands. Not in all countries, but in many of our countries. So it's how we manage that resource. Decision support, evidence-based decision making. That is not something that factors highly in the water sector. It has to be addressed. We have to look at how do we model? And again, CIMH has been doing some excellent work in that regard. We have to make that information available. And now with the use of artificial intelligence, it now allows us to do even more innovative stuff. Water services. I can talk the whole day about this. How we treat with rainwater. Again, going back to what I just said, we have water utility companies that capture water, treat that water, store it, and then pump it to your home at great cost, and then you promptly flush that water down the toilet. That doesn't make sense. So we don't do rainwater harvesting in our region. We don't manage our water resources properly. We don't manage wastewater properly, which I know is something that's very dear to the heart of Christopher Corbin. Whenever we talk about wastewater, Chris is always strong to say, don't forget wastewater. All of our companies are water and wastewater companies, but wastewater is the poor stepchild that nobody pays attention to, and it creates many, many problems for all of us. That has to be looked at. Non-revenue water, 40 to 60%, you heard Prime Minister Morty speak about. If we can deal with that, then we've dealt with many of our problems in the water sector. Research, development, and innovation. You know, Bob Marley says, in the abundance of water, the fool is thirsty. We all are islands sitting in large bodies of water. Can we take some of that water and desalinate it and use it to augment our water supplies during the dry season? You have companies, there's one here at the table that I was sitting in Invictus, and we'll hear from them later on, that's using solar energy and a very innovative way of treating with brine to allow countries like ours to be able to take salt water and turn it into potable water with no energy costs and with no impact on the environment. Why is that not replicated widespread across our region? Why is that not a disaster response thing that we put in place every time there's a hurricane and our water sector is impacted? And finally, public education and awareness. That has to change. You saw that there was talk of political buy-in. I think the problem with the water sector in our region is our politicians only pay attention to it during the dry season. Once the rainy season starts, we go back to normal, there's not a water problem. There is a water problem. There'll always be a water problem. And climate change is making that dry season last longer. It's making the rainfall in torrents, which is more difficult to manage. So the whole issue of educating people, making sure that they understand the issues that are confronting them, the issues of climate change. And maybe one final thing, educating our major policy holders. It bothered me when I was a Minister of Environment to attend two quoted meetings in 2015, a quoted on environment and sustainable development and a quoted on energy. We need to change the name of quoted. Everything is not trade and economic development. Maybe call it the Council on Sustainable Development, because we have to understand if we're talking about sustainable development goals, then trade and economic development are no more important than social development or environmental development. So it's how we look at things. It's a very big component of this whole public education or public re-education process. And I think that's something that we have to pay attention to. You know, Toffler said it, the
Jimmy?
illiterate of the 21st century are those who, not those who can't read or write, those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I think that's what all of us have to do. Thank you so very much, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you. So I think Jimmy's left us off at a good place. I think we've seen across the three speakers quite a bit of insight in terms of what's happening with our water governance frameworks. We have the frameworks, we have the plans, we have the strategies, we have the links, but we do still have some structural issues. We're still dealing with things in silos, etc. I want to open up the floor now to questions, and I see we have one online. And I also invite anyone who's actually here in person who wants to ask a question to please do so. So the first question we have is what changes will be done in the region from leadership level to ensure good governance, enforcement of legislation, and proper maintenance of infrastructure? And I ask all three of our panelists to give this one a good thought.
That's an excellent question. And I think the answers go beyond water. So all of our leaders have been busy in every forum that would listen, talking about the reform of international finance, the Bridgestone Initiative, the Green Climate Fund, because access to finance is one of the key things that we will need to unlock a lot of the development potential related to water. So I'll just leave it as
Thank
that
you
for
very
now.
much, Kareem. I'm going to give everybody a chance to identify one thing. Okay, Jimmy, do you want to go next?
One thing, political awareness. I think, I don't know that our leaders truly understand, not all of them. I mean, Prime Minister Motley clearly does, but I don't know that every leader has that level of understanding of how serious this water problem is and how much they need to elevate water to the front of the development agenda. Because if you don't deal with water, you can't talk about the tourism industry, you can't talk about an agricultural sector, you can't look at the long-term development of your country, you can't talk about disaster response. So it's that awareness outside of the dry season, that awareness 365 days of the year, that the water problem is probably one of the biggest problems confronting every single country, even Dominica that's blessed with an abundance of water resources. If you speak to the manager of Dowasco, he will tell you that he has water problems. They may not be non-revenue water problems, but there are serious water problems like energy problems that he has to deal with. So I think elevating water to the top of the development agenda is probably the biggest thing that needs to take place in every single one of our countries.
Thank you, Jimmy. Farzana?
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to piggyback on the awareness that Dr. Fletcher spoke about because I think that that really is quite one of the main issues, really. And the situation that we're in right now, the climate crisis, we are having an issue of water insecurity. I know that there are debates as to what water security is, but in our various countries and within our region, certainly we are having or experiencing that fresh water is not readily available, at least not without a cost. So certainly awareness, in my opinion, is one of the major things that we need to address.
Thank you all. Yes, we have a question from the floor. Please go ahead.
Hi, Natalie Hutchinson, Canadian High Commission. So you've all spoken about some of the challenges which are applicable to the majority of the countries in the region. Are there any examples that you would like to highlight of countries that have done particularly well, whether it's with the water resource management, whether it's the governance, any particular aspect that you would like to highlight as a positive that others can then learn from? Thanks.
Thank you, Natalie. Farzana? Seems to have an idea.
To some extent, I can point out St. Lucia, the fact that there was actually a separation between the water utility services and water resources management, because in many of the countries, the water utility is the one that also manages the water resources, and there can be conflict there, especially when it comes to water allocation. So I think that that is actually a good example, being able to separate water resources management from water utility services. But it also requires sustainable financing in order for that to be completely realized as an important factor towards water resources management in the region.
Thank you, Farzana. Jimmy or Kareem, we have another question, but wanted to give you a chance to respond to Natalie's question.
Yeah, but just to continue with what Fazana just said, but also to understand that some of these policies are not set in stone. So when I demitted office, we went back to the previous arrangement where the water utility and the water management and everything was put back under the same ministry. So I think again, it's that awareness that when things work, then we need to leave them. And we have a situation in our country where we always, just not in St. Lucia, but in many of the countries, where every time an administration changes, like 51st dates, you have to start all over again and reintroduce yourself. And that political buy-in, I think, is so important. That first thing that you saw trending is so important. And I can speak as a former member of the political directorate. I think it is extremely important in the water sector.
Thank you, Kareem. It's
Yeah,
gonna be a
just
short one, but
no
please
problem.
go ahead.
Just quickly, a few countries in the region have been pursuing green economy and resource efficiency economies, and in that way, linking the efficiency of water use, the efficiency of land use, efficiency of waste, and promoting circularity brings all of the things together along with water, and I think that's a good way to go.
Great, thank you, Kareem. So we have two more questions. The first is, are there any projects happening within the region which look at wastewater specifically? And then there's a second question, how do you envision a regional approach to water resources management and governance, given that leaders will always tend to promote their own political agendas? Hot potato question. So who wants to jump in on that one?
I can try the second one.
Okay,
Even though
brave Kareem, jump in.
I literally don't know the answer to the first one off the top of my head.
Okay, sure.
Um, but one of the things that I didn't get a chance to mention with the Common Water Framework is this regional programmatic approach to support all of the countries in water management. So it looks at common standards for water harvesting, for water quality, water safety plans, specific climate resilience in the water sector, reducing non-revenue water, unlocking financing, and each of the CARICOM institutions, whether it's CXC even, CIMH, each has a role to play in. If water is really a developmental centroid, then each agency within CARICOM has a role to play, and that coordination can help move things forward.
Thank you. Who wants to tackle? We've got another question, but anyone wants to tackle the question on the projects happening? Farzana? Yes.
Just one, the Jeff Crew Plus project I know is tackling wastewater.
Mhm.
I don't have all the details of it, but I'm sure that Christopher Corbin would be very willing to speak to you about that.
Great. So you need to check on Chris Corbin, my friend. We have a fourth question. Given its importance, what improvements are required to ensure integrated planning, including urban, rural, and industry and agriculture at the country level? So this is gonna be a quick one. We've got 5 minutes left, and I see Liz also wants to ask a question. So I'm gonna try to wrap up in 3 minutes. So go.
Our governments, some governments understand the importance of development planning, particularly long-term development planning. I think that's something that has to be ingrained in the culture of all of our governments. This whole question of long-term development planning, bringing all sectors on board, particularly given the very serious multi-sectoral impacts of climate change, we can't continue to progress in a very ad hoc manner the way we've been doing. So hopefully it is something that we will embrace sooner rather than later, particularly for the water sector.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Liz, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and thanks to the panelists. So this morning we talked about partnership, and we also talked about the dynamics that we're seeing with respect to what's happening with water. Can we get a comment on the adequacy of the common water policy to deal with the real challenges that we're going to face with respect to climate change? Is there anything additional that we have to do in terms of the guidance documents at the regional level? Because I think there should be a clear recommendation on that coming out of the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Liz. That's Liz Riley, who is the head of SEDIMA, just in case. Again, another person I know, so I just called her Liz. Apologies. Yes, do you want to quickly answer? And then we're gonna go to the wrapping up stage.
Yeah, so the main challenge is that the common water policy has not been approved as yet, and it's been on the stove for a while. And one of the things that is really needed is that partnerships need to maintain momentum. And so Liz would know SEDIMA is one of the core reporting partners in that framework. But when was the last time we had a meeting on that? So we really need to reignite the momentum, and I'll be happy to speak with anybody that was deeply involved at that time, and to see what the challenges were, to see what we need to do better, and to see how we can move forward and rekindle that partnership.
And just to add, Lisa, at the very beginning of the Regional Strategic Action Plan, it highlights the fact that partnerships, this can't work without partnerships. Partnerships are extremely important in dealing with the water sector because of the number of organizations at the national and regional level involved in water. So you're absolutely right, Liz. We have to make these partnerships work as quickly as possible. Otherwise, we are diluting an effort where resources are very desperately needed.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to come back, and I think we really need to have a conversation on what partnerships working really looks like. So we've spoken about a central agency, we've spoken about a consortium of institutions, we've spoken about joint programming and projects and different things, but we really need to figure out what works best for a cross-sectoral thing like water, and to see, what really is the best solution, because same coordination and same partnerships is one thing, but it can take many forms. So I just wanted to add that.
I need to wrap up because I see that we're counting down to less than 2 minutes. I just want to really thank our panelists and also the persons online, persons here for these great questions. I think in summary, we can say that we've made some good progress on governance. We've had some challenges along the way, and we continue to have some sticking points, but there certainly are lots of opportunities and perhaps important pressures on us to really get this right and to be able to move. And some of the key ones definitely are about implementing what we've already agreed on, certainly looking at tackling the problem in a multi-sectoral way, and certainly the issue of partnership, and the issue also of political buy-in. I just want to wrap up with that and invite all of you to participate in the end of session poll. Tell us what you thought. I know there's one last question about the issue of financial shortcomings. And I know that this will be an issue that will come up in other panels, including one that I will be moderating. So I'll be sure to remember your question and make sure that it gets answered. Thank you so much. And I wish to hand back over to Alicia.
Thank you so very much, Lisa. Thank you to our panelists. Remember as well to fill out the poll on your conference booklets. For those of you who are online, the Slido poll is up on the screen. Our next session is status of IWRM in the region, what has been done and what is required. For our virtual attendees, please make your way back into the auditorium to be able to join that next session. We will see you very shortly. Thank you all. Now let me introduce you to Adrian Cashman. He is a doctor. He has over 40 years of experience in the water sector and has been working in the Caribbean for the past 16 years. First with the University of the West Indies, the UE, and more recently as a water management consultant. Roger S. Pulwati is the senior scientist at NOAA's Physical Sciences Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado. Dr. Pulwati's research has over 120 publications focused on climate, water, science policy, and resilience. Roger is also the co-chair of SDG 6, so he probably knows what he's talking about. To begin our discussion, we have a poll because we want to know where this conversation is going. So what we want to ask you is, do you believe that integrated water resources management, or IWRM, is achievable and effective for the majority of countries in the Caribbean region? Those of you online, you can fill out the poll. And for those in person, you will see a QR code pop up on the screen very shortly. And we want to hear your feedback. We want to hear from you because Roger and Adrian are very committed to ensure that we get the right messages out so that we can have an effective IWRM in the region. So go on, fill out those polls. Let us see what you were saying. Tum tum tum. You can't hear him, but Adrian is making sound effects right now. So go on and fill out that poll. You have 1 minute, so do it quite quickly because, again, I have some very excited and enthusiastic panelists who are going to take some time with this conversation. So let's see, do we think IWRM is achievable? Yes, there we go. Keep filling out the poll. Ooh, ooh, ooh. These are some interesting results. I see there is some skepticism. The responses are quite interesting, don't you think, Adrian? You know you have a mic. Nobody can hear you.
Talk up.
But then the people online would hear you.
No. No, this is actually very interesting. And I say that because I posed a very similar question recently on LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
And the response that there was very similar to
Yes.
this. There were people, a number who said, no, we're not doing as well as we should be doing. Very few actually turned around and said, yes, IWRM is working. So the majority were sort of in between, as we're seeing here this morning.
Yes, because
sorry, this afternoon. With it depends on the context, and
well, I think the audience response really shows us that, you know, it signifies a diversity of perspectives and opinions on the achievability of IWRM. So let's just jump into our discussion. So Roger, I'm going to hand over to you. Oh, you're going to go first, Adrian? Okay.
Okay.
Go for it.
Thanks. In fact, this is something that I hope, if we have time, that I will come back to. Right, let's see if this will work.
Oh, don't worry, the presentation's coming.
Right.
Don't we just love technology?
We love technology, especially when it doesn't work. Right, we just need to go back. Right, so I'm going to jump straight in. This is just more of a framing sort of thing for you. I'm not going to talk very much about it. Just to say, we're all in this room. We've all been talking about IWRM. Therefore, in my mind, it's a dominant paradigm. It's been around for not a decade, not 2 decades, but it's been around for about 30 odd years. In fact, even going back to 1992 to the Rio summit there. What is it about? We've heard Fazana earlier on said what it's about. But what I would say to you is that we've come to buy into what IWRM as a concept. It's become something normative. It's what we all believe in. It's what we think is a good thing. And this has framed a lot of the discussions, the developments that we've seen, not just in the Caribbean, but around the world. It's had its advocates with, for example, Global Water Partnership has been advocating for this for a very long time. But there are those who say that it is actually not such a good thing, that it is too vague, that it can't decide on what it is. Is IWRM something where we are a utilitarian approach, where we are trying to get the maximum good out of things? Or is it looking at justice, social justice? So philosophically, it's got very mixed roots, I would say, and something I'm beginning to start to think about. But let's have a look at what's happening. And you've already heard this morning about some of the things that are happening. We've had the 2010 CARICOM agreement, the Common Water Framework, we've had Jeff IWCAM, and so on. And other agencies over the years have invested in IWRM either as the focal point or as part of the work that they've been doing. But one of the things I would point out, so we can ask the question, why haven't we, after so much time, why haven't we made as much progress as we possibly would like? And I think one of the things, and I'm going to put this to people, is that a lot of the push for IWRM has come from external sources. It's been tied to aid. It's not been something that we in the Caribbean, the institutions, have really pushed. Now that is changing, you could argue, with OECS and what CARICOM are doing. But I think that has been something of a barrier in the past. This is something we have to do, because if we don't do it, we don't get the money. You can agree with me or not on that. And that's why I say it's been included explicitly or implicitly as a condition for access to those funds. And usually what it has included is a suite of interventions: developing national water policies, establishing water resources agencies, we've heard about that, and sometimes legislative reviews. So those are the things that have been sort of thrown at us. What have we been doing? I'm not going to go through all of this, but there are some good examples of things that have happened. And a question came up: is there anywhere in the Caribbean where water resources management is being done well. And yes, I know St. Lucia has got its water resources management unit, but I would like to actually highlight that Jamaica has been in this game for a much, much longer time. And I think that is an example of a good practice that we could certainly build on. So there are at various stages these things that we've been trying to do. And there are some good examples. St. Kitts and Nevis, for example, have picked up on that that OECS model water policy and legislation that was done something like 10 years ago. So another message is, it's a bit like elephants giving birth. It takes a very long time and it happens at high level. So how are we doing generally in the Caribbean about IWRM and its implementation? And this slide shows the recent survey. And quite honestly, we're not doing very well at all across all the aspects. And this is self-reporting. This is countries reporting what they think they've been doing. And obviously there are question marks over that. So even by our own self-reporting, we've got a long way to go. Some observations about what have we got going for us, if you like? Well, one of the things is that we've got a strong epistemic community around IWRM. What do I mean by that? I mean everybody in this room. You all believe in IWRM. Do you believe in IWRM?
That's not enthusiastic enough.
No, come on. Do you believe? You see, you're mirroring the response that we got earlier on. You're not convinced. But you as a community can champion this. We're struggling to cross over into the policy area. And maybe when we have some questions, I can come back to that. I've got to hold some things back. Harnessing the opportunities that are there actually comes down to finance. That, I think, is one of the core issues about that is preventing us from going as fast as we would like, is the access to the finance and, for example, with water resources agencies, making sure that they are self-financing and not just one-off. A few observations, questions, things that you could perhaps think of when you want to come ask a question is, do we know what integration means? What are we integrating? There's been some hints at it. The other thing is that I've noticed over the years that IWRM has evolved to take in the current flavor of the year. So we talk about IWRM and climate change, IWRM and gender, IWRM and innovation. So we seem to have some shifting goalposts. And there's this confusion. In the poll that I did, people came up and said, the real problem is governance. And I said, well, what do we mean by governance? And there was no real clear answer to that. And I think people get confused between government and governance. And the other thing is that I want to say is, where is the role of the outsiders? Not the people in government and in government associated agencies, but the outsiders like the private sector, NGOs and communities in IWRM. I'm going to end off with one observation, whether you agree with me or not, is that the way that we have configured our legislation, the way that we've talked about integrated water resources management, it's become a closed shop. We're talking to each other. We are not giving a voice and a role, not just a voice, a role to those who are not within government or within government agencies to shape governance. So I'm going to leave it there and hand over to my colleague who is going to probably disagree with me.
Thank you for that, Adrian. And I do have a question about IWRM and the private sector, but we will get to that in our conversation. So Roger, over to you now.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I won't disagree too much with Adrian, because then we'd both be wrong. So, IWRM is extremely complex, as we know, and I always tell people, confidence is that warm feeling you have just before you really understand the problem. And so as we think through this, right, one thing I do want to mention, coming from the Prime Minister's comments on the role of women, this year, 2023, is the 70th anniversary of the Barbados Women's Alliance being created, which actually then led to the movement for women's rights and voting around the Caribbean region. My great aunt co-chaired that meeting here in Barbados in 1953. Things and change do happen. As we think through this, and I figure out how to work this thing or put it on stun at least, at the right direction.
Press the green button.
The green, we go, green goes. So I'll talk about integrated watersheds and streams of thought, and we try to get back to some of these sorts of questions. As we think about this, see if we can move this. Yeah, try that green button. Yeah. Let me see if I get it there. Change is ahead, right? So that seems to work. As people have heard me speak before, I always say, well, that you don't need to be the Dalai Lama to know that change is ahead. And as we think through this, we'll ask the question, what's been done? And you've heard quite a bit of this. And actually some of the big successes, which I think do exist, Mark Barnett, who is here, is quite very much responsible for things that happened in Jamaica, the case that Adrian mentioned. But I do want to say that the comments you're hearing from Adrian and myself are drawn from lessons. And I'm going to step back around and ask, are we simply drawing lessons or are we actually learning them, which are two different types of foci. Timing begins to matter a great deal. Years ago, we did an analysis of places in the world where adaptive management efforts were being done in different watersheds. And I like to call them problem sheds because the problem shed is not the same size as the watershed, it's actually bigger. And we have to ask the question, if only the red dots can be considered successful, and we'll come back to what that means, why is there this limited record of success? And those red dots are highly contextual. Once again, it becomes very easy to characterize integrated approaches, but very difficult to implement in practice. But the symbolic rationality and the seductiveness is we do need integrated approaches. We do need to understand how connection happens. But human beings have a strong sense of hubris. As I like to say as scientists, we can understand the most complex problems. It's the obvious that takes us longer to get around to. And the way we think about this is really the fact that we do not manage systems, we manage our interactions with them. And therefore, what are the entry points? And I'll come back to some of this. So for the time being, we know this. From the climate standpoint, I was the convening lead author on the IPCC, worked by David Farrell, Michael Taylor, a whole host of other people, Leonard Nurse, really does in fact point us to, we're in a complex compounding and cascading set of events. We saw that with Hurricane Irma and Maria. We saw responses in Dominica and elsewhere. But the key lesson here is, as framed by the Prime Minister, as framed by Clinton White and others, the lack of access to fresh water is the driver. For most small islands in the Pacific that we also work with, that's the driver. It's not hurricanes, it's not sea level rise, it's the lack of access to fresh water. Anybody knows in this room, there's a major El Nino warm event coming. It means a whole lot for the Caribbean region. In the context of the movement and the improvements in climate science, the movement of moisture is the most important thing that we understand. The reason why we're affected by an El Nino in the Pacific has to do with the movement of moisture or not into our region, heat and moisture. So we are on a water planet. We did the workshop, as some of you know, in March, the UN water meeting, some almost 50 years after the first one in 1977, and there have been improvements in sanitation. But beyond that, there haven't been major improvements in protecting people's human right to water. This is one of the first administrations in history in the US that is framing the problem as a root cause question and the funding behind it. This is quite forward looking. But when it comes to how we're coordinating and how we're acting, we're still falling short. And we'll come back to what some of that means in practice. So what are the rules of the game? It seems like we're playing two different games and a series of paradoxes that occur, right? Let's get the biggest economic value of that drop of water and also protect for the environment. Let's actually work on how people are made have more equitable access, and let's privatize water at the same time. So as we can find out, we're asking multiple questions of the same resource. So the factoring resiliency in water resources system design and planning is still the safest approach, given what we know about our ability to predict water and hydrological events with any major degree of accuracy into the future. So how do we look at this? A while back, Mr. Barnett, myself, and others were engaged in an activity with the Inter-American Development Bank, with OECD, with a whole host of others on asking the question, how do we get ahead of this challenge? Investing in the science and data to better understand the dynamics. We do not know the inputs and the outputs. And given the unreliability or the irregularity of use of water and availability of water in the Caribbean, it's very hard to determine what demands are and how we get that in line with other things. Most critically is to take a resilience approach, shift from building water infrastructure alone towards delivering the services that are in fact needed and working back from that. We hear a lot about silos. Silos have a basis in policy and practice. There's a reason for them, because you're accountable and have autonomous control on your resources. So instead of throwing our hands up at them, we have to ask, how do we align the pieces instead of saying, let's break down silos? So ensuring the development assistance community considers sector level alternatives before project selection takes place. This is a big one. It seems like an obvious thing to do. Not just be proactive, but be prospective. How do we not let new risks arise? Whenever someone says to me, let's be proactive, I always say, yeah, you first, because it implies an upfront cost. So the roundtable on financing that Mark and I were engaged in laid out a set of areas that we can think about for nature-based solutions. The Convention on Biodiversity in December, the midterm assessment of the Sendai Agreement 2 weeks ago that I was at, the UN Water, all pointed to the difficulties, but the need for implementing nature-based solutions as buffers for a changing environment. And so as we think through the benefits and costs of this, we have to ask the question, and the Prime Minister mentioned, $1 today saves us 7, 10. But the problem with that is that's over a long time. And whenever we complain about politicians having a short time frame of 3 to 4 years, the private sector has a time frame of quarterly. We have many time frames that we need to align and work together on. So to begin to wrap up, and I'm not wrapping up, it gives confidence to the moderator that something is happening. Novel configurations of land use have the biggest bang for the buck. So in spite of knowing that land use configurations, water resources, I work a lot on the Colorado River and other things like that, have the biggest bang for the buck for years, more than retrofitting, we are not coordinating in a way that delivers those outcomes. So economics alone is not the only thing that matters. So what do we need to do? Advance the governance of our knowledge and our practice across these many different institutions for political authority and coherence, a culture of partnerships, decentralize, we ask for coordination and yet we ask for decentralization, but to understand that partners do not just co-develop products, we share the risks and shaping the future together in terms of accountability. As one of my colleagues who is in fact the rain priest on the Hopi Nation in the four corners of the US likes to say, whenever someone asks him, how does the rain dance work? You know, in Aztec culture, the Chacmul goes to the rain god and asks for rain. He said, make sure you do the rain dance just before it rains. Timing. There are groups that have taught us how to coordinate. David Farrell has led this, Liz Riley, many others, teaching us how we work across different agencies without subsuming the accountability and autonomy of specific agencies. One of the major missing things we have are the capabilities of guiding just transitions, the cadre and critical mass of within region, science and services, water, climate, and institutional people. I've been involved, Natalie Hutchinson is in the back there, all on creating that cadre of people who build the networks, who act as the policy entrepreneur, working between these different groups. That's genuine transdisciplinarity, being in practice and knowing about practice. This nature is something that's missing. Who is to make transitions work? No matter how well designed and how long does it take? So to wrap up, we need to go from a theory of change to a practice of change. Most importantly, we have to realize how we align information, but critically, we're still in this. I'm sure glad the whole isn't on my end. That's still where we are. But more than anything, we can't disappoint that person holding the planet in her hands. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Roger. What a note to close off those presentations on. So just to backtrack a little bit to Adrian's point, the private sector has long since complained that it has not been involved in very important conversations that are seemed to be only public sector based or only NGO based or only donor based. How do we get the IWRM to resonate to the private sector?
If I had the answer to that, I'd have made a fortune already. It is actually, it's a question that in Global Water Partnership, globally, not just Caribbean, that a couple of years ago we looked at. And what we were seeing was almost in the sort of more government, public sector, a focus on IWRM, whereas in the private sector, we were seeing more on water stewardship and that sort of approach to water efficiency. How do you bridge that? How do you bridge that gap there? I think first of all, we have to recognize that we are in partnership, and it's a word that is going to keep coming up for the rest of the day and tomorrow. That we're already in, and there are some examples where the private sector does play a role, and I go back to the case of Jamaica, where in addition to the National Water of Water Services, that has been recognized within the policy and the legislation. And I think there has to be an opening up of the possibility that the private sector can start playing a role in the provision of water services, not just as a contractor, because you could argue that it does play a role as a contractor, but as a partner now. But we do have to be careful about how that is regulated, because worst case examples, I think, are what's happening, we see in the British water sector at the moment, where there's a lot of rent taking by companies at the expense of the customer, the consumer, the citizen. So we do have to recognize, I think, within policy and translate that into regulation that there is a role, and be honest, and we're going to have to do it because government is not going to be able to deliver on all of its promises by itself from its own resources.
I see Roger nodding his head quite fervently.
Well, I was trying to do this. No, that's
No,
quite,
that's
yeah,
Bulgarian.
quite all right.
That's
Yes.
Bulgarian for yes.
Yes, it is. So as we think through this, and this is something Wangari Maathai warned us about years ago, there is no incremental approach to simply adding a sector called the private sector without a different way of thinking about the resource and what it means to people. In addition to the private sector, there's civil society, the people that hold our feet to the fire on equity. As we think through this, and I mentioned the mismatch of timescales already and how we make our decisions, the question is, can we craft a marketplace for resilience in water that relates to the territories across the Caribbean region and to particular watersheds? And the reason why I'm phrasing it that way is it's been very difficult to get really strong examples where the private sector has actually implemented nature-based solutions globally. We did this assessment in the global report for 2022, unless it's underwritten by the public sector. So what I would ask is, what's the thinking that's needed that asks us to accept a little bit less in the present, maintain our quality of life, build a marketplace for resilience that actually gets the investments in the long-term strategies that also provide near-term needs. And I can give some examples of that. One of the missing things we have is what we call the sovereign liquidity risk. The fact that after a disaster, and planning for the long term are the two time scales we think about, but not what is available and open in the window of opportunity to fix the near term while planning for the long term.
Now, I know we're talking about integration, and integration across any sector is a very complex issue, and even more so with our Caribbean water sector. So, when we talk about integration, what exactly does it look like? And are we really serious about integration at this point in time?
Whoa.
Roger just passed the buck. He just pointed at
Yeah.
Adrian.
Integration can mean many different things to many different people. We can talk about integration within the water sector itself, and I think that is probably where most of us would go. So the integration, or how we coordinate, how do we bring partners in within the water sector? So how do we make arrangements between government agents, different government agencies that have a role to play in water? It could be environmental protection, it could be drainage, and obviously water services. So how do we integrate within the sector? That's one way of thinking. That to me is very short-sighted. I don't think that's the type of integration that we need. What we need is the integration, and I don't really see very much of this, is the integration between how you develop, let's say, a national water plan and how that resonates with a national development plan. We should be starting with the national development plan and see how the water plan supports that. So it's an integration across sectors, because a national development plan would not take in not just water, but agriculture, industry, commerce, tourism, space exploration, whatever. That is the integration that I think we need. It's the hardest because you're bringing people together from different disciplines, with different vocabularies, with different agendas, with different timescales. But if we are to integrate within water, I think we need to integrate across. And that brings me to another point, is about planning, and Roger mentioned planning, is that, and I'll make a very bold statement here, is that I don't believe, and I know that it's not entirely true, by the way, but I would say, put it to you, that the water sector, the water utilities and governments do not do water planning. You do not do planning for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. There is no water plan for that. If you haven't got a plan, how can you integrate? How do you know what is going to be best for the future? And that has been, I was really struck when I first came here some 16, 17 years ago, having come from a water planning background, to find that this was not happening. And it is still not happening. Roger.
Sure. So to build on this, but somewhat lacking all continuity to it. How'd you like that? Yeah. As we think through these things, Adrian's quite right. The question about planning is critical, but I don't want us to just be at the point at which we say more planning is needed. The idea, I think, filters back from a lot of lessons we have in disaster risk reduction. And I don't know if Liz Riley is in the room. Oh, good, I could steal her ideas. The issue is one of working back in the case of water security, managing water-related risk, and meeting goals to ask, what is it that we're after? And then working back from asking the question, where do our scenarios matter? When we're in the disaster risk realm, we ask the question, communities are mobilized to protect themselves, their assets, and their livelihoods. There's budgetary alignment and support. There's broad-based awareness of the vulnerability issues. And awareness is critical, and so are tools. But as my father used to say, if you give me some wiring, a light bulb, a screwdriver, I'm still not an electrician. Tools only go so far. And in fact, many people are shocked when they find out what a bad electrician I am. Anyway, the idea here is really who are we training to use these tools and to work among the public, private, and civil society so that it informs the planning that Adrian talked about.
You know,
That
Roger,
finance,
I
yes.
think that is a very important point because, again, job matching.
Right, right.
Job matching is really critical. So, who exactly are we training for these jobs in IWRM?
Go ahead. You and I have tried to do this together, actually.
Well,
Yeah.
this is first of all, I think we have to look at what do we mean by training. Usually, let's say somebody goes to university or does a course, they study for a period of time, they come out with a qualification. Are they trained? No, they're not. They have the basics. This takes a lot of time. It's as Roger said a bit earlier, it's about building networks, understanding how other related sectors work, what their language is, what their priorities are. And that takes time to do. So we need to, in building a cadre of IWRM professionals or practitioners rather, because I think that's a fairer way of describing it.
Agreed.
Is that we need to provide an opportunities to interact, to mentor and to, as I say, create those opportunities. Now, that is quite difficult and goes against the way in which we train our professionals. You join BWA as a graduate engineer. You have a training program. You go into construction, you go into distribution, you go into water treatment. That is not training somebody for integrating what they know. We need to look at ways, and universities are one way of doing it, and postgraduate programs, as both Roger and I have worked on, have tried to do that. But we need to go beyond that. And that actually is something that goes beyond, often with projects, we talk about a training and capacity building component. But when the project finishes, when the funding runs out, that comes to an end. And we have to move away from this project or stop-start approach to a more programmatic approach, to look beyond. How do we make sure that there's a legacy to a lot of these programs? I mean, the Crew Plus project has got an academy. It's got a lot of material. But Chris, what's going to happen to that when the funding runs out? Who's going to access it? So we have to start in building this cadre of people. We need to start addressing some of those issues and thinking more creatively about making opportunities to bring people together in partnerships.
Just to add quickly, one of the things we do want to keep in mind, and Adrian points to it, is the nature of that practitioner or professional is not necessarily what we think it is. I'm going to challenge everyone in this room because you are the examples that have tried to make this transdisciplinary link. And you know the struggles you've had. I was talking to Sabira about this, where guaranteed working in an integrated setting has no specific job that you're put into. That's why silos exist. That's why disciplines exist. So unless we're asking how do we support those people in these roles as part of funding resilience, then we'll not get at resilience. Resilient infrastructure means little without resilient people. And as folks like Natalie and others could tell you, we've tried to craft people in that space, and they've also struggled to find the roles where they're accepted in a multidisciplinary area. People like David and others have tried to nurture them. So the question is, what's the mentoring and funding to support resilience and the professionals? And again, as others who know me in this room and were mine and Adrian's students, there's a fine line between a mentor and a tormentor.
Now, as we're talking, I want to pick up on something both Adrian and Roger have spoken about. I mean, all of us are in this room and we are planning for our resilience. We are
Right.
planning. We are
Right.
always planning. All of our agencies are planning and planning and planning. When we talk about sustainability, how do we move from projects to programs to
To
actual results?
You go first
Sure.
this time.
So we have to ask the question, are we just funding adaptation projects or are we creating adaptive systems? And this is where the idea of integrated watershed management is critical, but we should not equate that with managing the full system, but what the nodes are for collapsing that system. In other words, where are the impediments to the flow of information? Where are partnerships needed? And who is to craft those? We have examples where such things have worked. I deliberately put those 4 out of 200 cases to show that they take vigilance, not just financing, definitely needed. They take vigilance, they take a few champions, and they take a willingness to experiment. Without those,
Yeah.
we don't create adaptive systems because then they don't learn.
Yeah. I think moving from projects to programs comes back to what I was saying about planning. If you develop a plan that is integrated with your development and your other sectors, and you have a 10, 15, 20-year horizon, an idea where you would like to be, then yes, you will have projects that are part of that planning that bring you towards that goal. But very much at the moment, it seems to me that because we don't have that longer term perspective, we are reacting to immediate problems and focusing on projects that will address those immediate problems. And if we don't, if we will continue doing that, and because in a way, money is attached to certain funding agencies' programs. So Green Climate Fund, everything has to have a climate focus. So what do? We look at projects that we were thinking of doing and we scratch our heads to say, Roger, how can we put climate into this, right? And then Roger comes up with a great idea and says, you know what, that's going to cut down greenhouse gas emissions. Fine, we go for it. And we put in a wastewater system. You know, we're following the money rather than following where we want to be and then looking at the projects that will help us get to that point.
So we're looking at proactive planning.
Well, it's a little more than proactive in the sense that being proactive and in the disasters arena is there's an impending risk. How do we respond ahead of time? Being prospective, which water allows, is to understand how to not let new risks arise. And so that distinction we're using much more in the context of the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction and so on. To be clear, when we're dealing with a forecast and early warning, we are trying to respond proactively. Prospectively means how do we understand the co-benefits of water and what it produces to the entire economy and society that does not let us have new risks emerging.
Now, just before we move into our question and answer segment, I have one more question, and I'm going to start off with
I
Roger.
thought this was the question and answer session.
Oh, no. We have to give everyone else a chance.
Actually, I'm hoping for just an answer session when you guys.
Okay. Well, we have 2 minutes left on our panel.
All right.
And so what we're going to do is, Roger, you chair SDG 6. Now,
For the US,
specifically, yes, specifically, I want to ask about investing in science and data
Absolutely.
through SDG 6A1. How can that work in the Caribbean?
So one of the things we've tried to do, in fact, the OAS did a workshop at the end of last year in Dominica, asking this very question. Where and how do we advance the observations? And again, we're talking about observations of vulnerability and risk as much as the physical system. And then where and how do we create this cadre of professionals who are actually transdisciplinary, who can analyze the data and information, but also understand the context of its use. and who it's to benefit. So from that standpoint, we've got, the Caribbean Academy of Science, we've got the different types of funding that we're doing, but everyone in this room who has grown up in the Caribbean knows the experience I've had, which is if you're not a doctor or an engineer, what exactly are you? And the idea of working across regions, the environment, and getting at issues of depletion of land, land degradation and planning is not actually something we take seriously as careers.
Roger, thank you so very much. Adrian, as well, thank you. And I know I took up all of the questions and I do apologize, but we will be collating the questions. And I commit that Roger and Adrian will be responding to your questions, especially those online. And those of you who are in the room, feel free to pull them aside at lunch or on a break and make sure they clarify their positions to you. Right now, we do have a poll that we are asking you to fill out. Those online would see the poll popping up on VFairs. Those of you in the room, please go to your conference packet and fill out those polls.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you
Alicia,
so very much.
Can I give you one last comment that relates to
Sure.
both of us? I'll ask the group as we go through the next few days, ask yourselves who pays for resilience? And where and how we can create the partnerships that support new markets and resilience. And then ask the question, how does that help inform integrated approaches? To Adrian's point, don't define it as integrated first, get the capabilities.
What a note to end on. Thank you so very much. Our next panel is coming up. A round of applause for our IWRM status. And our next session is Climate and Water and Ecosystem Nexus Impact of Future Climate on the Water Sector and Ecosystem Management in the Caribbean. So that begins shortly. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much. And this is the end of our session. So you can, if we keep staying, yes, no, you won't sing Calypso. So our next set of speakers, could you please make your way to the stage? Chris Corbin, Jillian Caldwell, and Dr. Bino. Shantis?
our session. And so get your fingers and buzzers or whatever it is that you need to get ready to participate in the poll. The poll question, I don't see it up, so I guess I'm going to read it. What should be the highest priority actions to address the impacts of climate change on water and wastewater resources in small island developing states? So there you go. So you've got 1 minute to make your mark on this issue. We're going to do a quick review of the issues and we're going to then lead in from that to our speakers. Thank you very much. So in this case, we are going to get a word cloud. And so let's see what we get. So right now we can see that finance is a big one. We have finance, financing, and finances so far, as well as community engagement. And innovative technologies so far. Excuse me. And finance is running ahead of the game again. And there's a new horse, or there was planning and capacity building. Thank you, everyone. Great. We're getting lots of input. We're definitely seeing some ongoing themes from session to session in terms of finance, partnership, community, stakeholder engagement, capacity building, and an emphasis on planning. Thank you, everyone. That was great input, and we're definitely going to build on that in terms of this session. We're going to start off with Gillian, if I can call you Gillian, who is going to give us a kind of strategic level, high level think through of the climate and water crises and how they're combining, and how we should think about this issue in the context of water and wastewater resources management. While she's there, we're going to be, of course, asking Gillian to do many things while also telling us a little bit also about the work of USAID in this context. Gillian, thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you here in person, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thanks to everybody, all the hard work by my colleagues at USAID and our partners to bring this amazing conference together. Water is life. It's the theme of the conference, but as we're aware, probably more acutely here in a small island, developing state than anywhere else in the world, water can also mean death. 90%, almost 90% of climate-related disasters are water-related. That's either due to an overabundance of water in terms of flooding and typhoons, or the droughts, which of course devastate the Horn of Africa as we speak. At this point in time, water scarcity is confronting 4 billion people around the planet for at least an entire month out of every single year. Severe water scarcity. And projections are that by 2025, at least 50% of the population on planet Earth could be confronting severe water scarcity. This matters, of course, for so many different reasons, but let's first talk about why we're seeing these challenges. Of course, we're having dramatic increases in rainfall and dramatic reductions in rainfall. We already heard about the 20% decrease in rainfall that you're contending with here in Barbados. Those water-related events in turn cause damage to critical infrastructure, which is what we need to deliver water and waste management. The drought also, as well as rising sea levels, leads to saline intrusion, which pollutes our water sources. And importantly, we're seeing rapid urbanization in so many countries around the world. Often when we think about development, we have a vision in our mind of the farmer, but almost 50% of the world's population now lives in cities. And those resources, especially those water resources, are stretched. And water, of course, matters, as we all know, because if we haven't got water, we'll have declines in agricultural productivity, we'll have increases in prices, we'll have decreases in nutrition. This in turn has huge impact on children. We'll see stunting of their growth, their intellectual and physical growth. So yes, water is life, and it can also mean death in the very in a very real sense of the word. Water is also about equity. Water insecurity has a disproportionate impact on women, many of whom are the ones responsible for gathering water, right? Additionally, extreme weather events, water-related extreme weather events and other extreme weather events are nearly twice as likely to kill or injure women as they are men. And of course, where food insecurity is concerned in many, many cultures, women are expected to wait until the men in the household and the children have had a chance to eat. So they may bear a disproportionate brunt of these water shortages. So for all these reasons, water is so integrally linked to the climate crisis and so integrally linked to the opportunity for impact that we have as an aid agency and as a government that's deeply committed to addressing these issues. We established, the White House recently established an action plan on global water security, calling for a whole of government response to the issue. And at USAID, we're doing things like upgrading weather stations to ensure advanced warning of extreme weather events, which can, of course, reduce the loss of life and livelihoods and save money down the line. We're preparing and investing in early warning systems and coral reefs. We're supporting the upgrading of critically needed infrastructure. And here again, I want to echo the earlier panelists who talked about infrastructure as not just the so-called gray infrastructure, but also the nature-based solutions that we need to preserve and protect these watersheds. And of course, those nature-based solutions, for example, protecting coastal waterways using things like seagrasses and mangroves, have the added benefit, not just of protecting the coast from erosion, but also of being carbon sinks, with mangroves containing almost twice the carbon that the critically needed forests do. So there are a lot of ways in which USAID is investing, and you heard Ryan's announcement earlier today of USAID's Water for All pitch competition. That, of course, is an opportunity to introduce us to your innovations. We saw an innovation just outside in the expo here that's focused on a solar-powered system to desalinate water with zero carbon and zero environmental impact. So the brine that's removed from the water is in turn reintroduced into the ocean rather than polluting surrounding systems. One more comment, I think, before I move it to my colleagues, because I know we want to have time for questions. As we think about resource scarcity, which comes up again and again in addressing these challenges, USAID is really dedicated through our climate strategy to catalyzing substantial new financial resources to tackle this crisis. We have a goal to catalyze $150 billion in public and private finance by 2030. And one of the ways we can do that, and have done that in the Caribbean, in fact, is by investing in support, the technical assistance necessary to allow countries in this region to prepare successful grant applications to the big multilateral institutions such as the Green Climate Fund. Those can be very out of reach for some of the countries that need that funding the most. With a mere $1.6 million investment in the 5 Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Action Center, we were able to support them in catalyzing over $50 million from the Green Climate Fund. And those are the kinds of investments we want to continue to make. 27 million of that funding was for water security. So we have to be thinking about how we use our limited concessional finance to pry loose the capital that needs to be moving further and faster, and especially from the private sector. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And for those who know me, will be very happy, know that I was very happy to hear the connection to gender and water. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. And as we wait for the presentation to start, let me also just acknowledge the significant support of USAID and its partners. And I think the mere fact that so many of us are referring to each other by the first name is testament to the fact that we do know each other. And I think this is really the strengthening of the existing partnerships which we already have. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but it's reinforcing what has been said throughout the morning session. We are going to be disproportionately, significantly, and very negatively impacted by climate change. We already are, and the projections are not looking good in terms of whether or not it's sea level rise, whether or not it's droughts, whether or not it's flooding. We have already heard and seen of the situation taking place just this week in Haiti. Water resources are going to be the ones that are most strongly impacted by climate change. And again, just reiterating many of the points made earlier, about the need to have water at the center of our development agenda, and not to disappoint my good friend Jimmy, water to include wastewater management, both in terms of not just the impacts, but also on the possible benefits that can be derived from properly treating wastewater. One of the critical things that we've seen is that with urbanization, with development, the demands are increasing. I don't envy anyone who has to govern a small island developing state. I applaud anyone who is in politics right now. It is challenging. And I think many of the utility managers who are here, we were just talking about how they're always firefighting. They're always having to react to demands from consumers, from industry, and from ministers and permanent secretaries. And therefore, the competition for the use of this limited resource is something which climate change is in fact exacerbating. How do you balance the demand for water for agriculture, for industry, for human health, and the often forgotten water for ecosystems integrity? We've heard so much now about the importance of biodiversity. The maintenance of our biodiversity depends on water. And I think so often we forget that there are other consumers of water apart from ourselves. And therefore, that bridge between climate change, water, and ecosystems is so critical. Coastal communities, small land and developing states, it's interesting to hear people talk about source to sea and ridge to reef. Anyone who's lived in a small island lives this every day. A heavy rainfall and the impacts of a heavy rainfall are going to be felt in the coastal area almost immediately. And therefore, the water sector, by definition, has to include a source to sea approach. We have to consider groundwater, we have to consider surface water. Climate change is impacting on those, and by extension, is impacting on the very resource base for our tourism industry, our coastal and marine environment. And I'm happy I'm seeing colleagues who are from that sector with us here. As we've heard, the water resources, as much as they're there, they're not in good shape. 25% of people throughout Latin America and the Caribbean lack access to drinking water. 66% have no access to safe sanitation services. And as much as we are making improvements, we have a long way to go. So I wanted to end just by reiterating the fact that this is linked. And when we talk about integration, it's not just about integration of sectors, of agencies, of institutions. It's the mindset that we have to use. It's the people we bring to the table so that there's a better understanding of how these impact collectively on people, planet, and prosperity. So on that note, I'd like to thank you, Chair, and move on to our next presenter.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks for talking about the drivers and pressures and leaving us with a nice link, building on what Gillian would have also talked about, the fact that we need to keep the people, the planet, and our prosperity always in mind as a combined entity. Paulette, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, a good afternoon to you. Let me first express my gratitude to the government of Barbados and to USAID for giving me an opportunity to participate in this very important event. So when I considered what I was asked to present, I thought it's a kind of housekeeping. It's stop taking time, because sometimes we have to take stock if we're going to move forward. And when we're taking stock, we have to ask some very hard questions. So we know that the climate crisis is a water crisis. We also know what the impacts are, the climate change impacts. The question is, what have we done about it? What are we doing about it? What will we do about it? So before I go to the opportunities, I want to remind us of some of the challenges, because I feel that we have the power to change things. The first is the culture that we have in the region: reactive approach, wait and see. And it's not that climate change is not urgent, but because there are differentiated impacts, we might say, well, it's happening in country X, but not in country Y as yet. And we have other priorities. So let's wait and see. When we wait and see, we have a reactionary, a reactive approach that is not based on a precautionary principle, and then we end up having to spend more, but we talk about financial issues. Then we have another issue related to the centralized water authorities with narrow missions. Water is a natural resource. You have to plan. Because when we talk about water and water issues, the issues are related to quantity and quality. If you're going to talk about sustainability, you have to plan. The water utility should not be planning. We have to have an entity that is going to plan for this resource. And management is not about the resource itself. Management is about how we interact with the resource, manage our interactions, our decision making. We have a lot of institutional fragmentation. We heard about this before. In studies that we have done, in every country, you have at least 10 entities with direct or indirect responsibility for water. So if we're going to move forward, we have to look at the absence of an integrated water resource management policy framework based on an ecosystems approach. Everything is connected to everything else. It's a basic ecological concept. Then why are we fragmented? Is it a case where we are competing for funds? Lack of robust data for decision making. Management of a resource, you cannot wake up one morning and decide this is what I'm going to do. You have to have the data. Then we have the implementation deficit. A lot of consultancies, and I don't want to shoot myself in the foot, I've been a consultant as well, but a lot of consultancies, but very little implementation, because sometimes the funding agencies have money for the study, but not for the implementation. We need to correct that. The flawed public perception of water and water prices. Well, water is a human right. Yeah, but you don't have to waste it. Right? So we have to correct that. Then funding for project implementation, we have inadequate monitoring and enforcement, of course, related to capacity issues. And we would have already been told about the very poor or outdated water-related infrastructure. So we have a lot of leakage and that sort of contamination and so on. So quickly, what are some of the opportunities? We must have water policies that confront the climate change risk. And we have our Dr. Cox from the 5Cs, who I'm sure will be able to talk about that. We have to confront the risk. And so a risk-based approach is very, very important. We also have to protect the aquatic and marine ecosystems as nature-based solutions, because in some island states, the aquatic and even the marine ecosystems are watershed areas. We have to protect them from pollution and that sort of thing. Greater collaboration. Prime Minister Motley spoke about this. We have to collaborate so that we can build our capacity, so we can have more access to resources and so on. Then we are talking about sustained and comprehensive public awareness, education, and training program. I am always amused when people talk about the importance of public awareness and education, because what a lot of times in reality, we put money into everything else and then we say, if we have additional funds, we are going to have some public awareness. But I want to remind persons of chapter 36 of Agenda 21. Education will always be the cornerstone for sustainable development. There is no other way, because we're moving from awareness to action. It's a process. Capacity building, very critical. Resource mobilization. And if we're going to mobilize resources, then we have to collaborate with each other. We have to share data. Disaster preparedness, not only response, but preparedness. Preparedness is about a proactive approach that you're taking. Water use efficiency. The technology is very important in innovation. How can we achieve the same goal using less of the resource? And it's the technology that will allow that. In water resources, how can we recover? Even when we talk about desalination, we need to use renewable energy because on the one hand, desalination will help us to adapt to a change in climate and the issue of the water deficit. But on the other hand, it is going to lead to greater greenhouse gas footprints.
Paulette?
And so we need to be able to balance that. So lastly, research and innovation. And here I'm not talking about just the good science, but the science that is demand driven, demand led. I'm talking about applied science, science that will relate to policy and help us to make a change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've had three very stirring contributions. I want to thank you. Thank you. I think they've put very much on the table some of the very key issues. And I think Paul has done a fine job of reminding us that as we have challenges, we also have opportunities. And so the question for us now is, how do we go about actually doing what we need to do? I'm not seeing any questions online as yet, so I'm going to open up the floor, though, to see if anyone here in the room would like to ask a question of the panel. Anyone, any eager beavers who have a piercing question that they want to put on the floor? Any clarifications that you will need, etc.? I know they're brilliant, but still, there's room for engagement. Yes, I see a familiar face coming up to the microphone. I also knew him when he was very young.
I will not say how long, Lisa.
No,
Hi.
no, no, no,
Good
no, no, tell them.
afternoon, all. Ricardo Marshall here. I just wanted to make a comment, given one of the things that Paulette said, that at the end of the day, water is certainly very, very important to us, especially in this region. You are in a country that is always on the top 15 most water scarce countries of the world listing, oftentimes in the top 10. Indeed, 8 of the top 30 are in this very region. Unfortunately, the climate crisis is not the water crisis. The water crisis is huge. It needs everything that we can put behind it, but it is one component of a much larger climate crisis. And I think we need to accept collectively all the time, because we all want our sectors to lead. But we need that holistic and all-encompassing approach in which we integrate water, we integrate energy, we integrate waste, we integrate ecosystems, land use, housing, all of those key sectors that all of the others then relate to. And it therefore relates not just to this session, but the session prior to this one, where what we need is that overarching national policy. We've taken those steps here, but we all need to have that overarching national policy that your programs then come out of, and your individual projects and your sectoral policies and plans come out of. What it means is that when you approach a GCF, a World Bank, whoever, you are going with your overall concept that you are delivering to them, and you're not going begging for funding. The issue is, this is my package. And this is the overall holistic thing. It includes climate and it includes development, because they cannot be separated. And we need to take that approach. If more entities took that approach, I think you will see a lot more of an acceptance at those separate levels. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gillian would like to respond to some of the comments that were made by Ricardo, and then I see there are a couple of online questions, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, just briefly, I think your point is very relevant, and it underscores why USAID has decided that it must become a climate agency. And that's because you can't do smart development without doing climate smart development. And that's because all of the gains that we have achieved as an agency and as a development community are jeopardized by the climate crisis. And at the same time, if we seize the opportunities to reinvent the way we're living our lives, we can build a fairer and more just world. So we're asking all of the programming threads across the entire agency, whether it's global health or economic development or the Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs or education or democracy, rights, and governance, to figure out how they can contribute to the goals we've articulated for ourselves, the North Stars we've established to substantially reduce emissions, to increase adaptation and resilience, to catalyze that finance, and so much more. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. So we've got two questions online. This one's going to be, the first one is, what does efficient water pricing look like given the cost? The second one is, there have been partnerships being developed with water facilities locally, but are there any region-specific avenues for funding and grants to expand the research and innovations in the region for researchers to explore? So those are the two, and then I see we also have,
Yeah, I'll try to answer the last one.
okay.
Uh, I think there are opportunities that exist. For example, even the CARICOM Climate Change Center, through the regional framework that is still being discussed, that there are many activities related to strategic goals that will allow for research, for innovation, and a sort of partnership. So all is not lost. I also know that Food and Agriculture Organization has been very much in the forefront in doing several things. USAID itself has been involved. And so it's just for us to really push ahead with the partnership for that, and to realize that a lot of and it doesn't have to be within the water sector itself, not even in the climate, because the intervention we had earlier reminded us of the fact that a lot of the issues that are facing the water sector are actually outside of the water sector. And Chris will know that everywhere I go, I like to push the DPSIR approach. Drivers, pressures, the state, the impact, then the response. And when you look at the drivers and the pressures, you realize that you are not dealing with the symptoms. And so this is why the research is important, that you can really understand the root causes of what is being manifested in the biophysical environment.
Thank you, Paulette. I see that Gillian also wanted to, and Chris as well.
Yeah, on the first question regarding how to price water, I mean, that's complicated, and I don't think you could answer in the abstract without really understanding the supply and demand and the cost. But I would just say that I visited a very innovative project that we launched in Peru, whereby communities agreed to pay a small tithe, i.e. a cent addition to their water bill, to help build a fund to grow nature-based solutions to protect their watersheds in and around Lima. And that was subsequently replicated across the country. And this goes back to the question, who pays for resilience? How do we think about the ecosystem of stakeholders? And how can we engage the community, which of course should not bear the sole responsibility for underwriting this, but again, has a stake in the solution. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gillian. Chris?
Thanks. And I actually wanted to touch base on an earlier question as well, but on the point of financing on a few of the projects that UNEP has been involved in, including the CREW project. So that answers the earlier question. There are a few regional projects looking at wastewater management. One is a joint initiative between the Inter-American Development Bank and UNEP on a Caribbean Regional Fund for Wastewater Management. And one of the key issues that that project also identified was the whole issue of tariff and pricing for water, and much more so for wastewater management. But as Jillian has said, it is not a simple thing. You've heard utilities fighting for years to get tariff increases. Some of the challenges has been the actual internalization of the cost of providing water from collection to treatment to disposal, to distribution, and then how to operate and maintain the equipment that's used. So I think there's a lot of effort to look at innovative financing, to look at nature-based solutions, to look at other ways through which there could be meaningful partnerships with both community and with private sector in terms of the pricing modality. Unfortunately, it's still looked at something that should be provided free. And that's where I think also that balance of water as a human right versus the actual cost. And in some cases, how are we going to recover those costs? I just wanted to add a point that Ricardo mentioned in terms of the energy issue. One of the major costs of water is energy. And again, now, how can we incorporate that into the whole planning process? It goes back to planning and how we ensure that then the sector is more sustainable in the long term and resilient to climate change.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's very true. Having done some work with the Water Authority, certainly one of the shocking things I found was the fact that they were one of the largest energy users of the Barbados Light and Power. And so our water does not come without a rather significant energy cost. So we really need to bear that in mind. Yes, sir. The floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Flynn. I'm the professor and a director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University in Boston, and thrilled to be working with University of West Indies here in Barbados with a now USAID funded project working on community resilience and climate adaptation. So we're thrilled to get started with that. My question is that I'm really struck with both water is life and Administrator Cole, you're talking about and death. Is the health dimensions of what we've been talking about here. And what I wanted to add is, we're talking the need for deepening collaborations and coordination, but the public health dimensions of all that we're talking about. How do we build, and maybe we are, but build better bridges between health explicit funding efforts and development focused efforts and disaster response efforts here? Because I see those things are still pretty siloed, and it just seems like we're talking about a common set of issues.
Thank you for your question. Panelists, who wants to jump in first?
I'll take a go at it. I think that throughout the region, we've really had a clear demonstration of the importance of water considerations in the health sector during the COVID-19 pandemic, because you're going to talk about washing of hands, very important to stem the spread of the virus. But then there are inequalities, because not every region, not every area in a country would have access to water to do what is necessary. And therefore, for me, it's important at the national level to have what is known as a national, well, in some countries, for example, in my own country, Guyana, a National Water Council. Of course, it needs to be resuscitated. But the idea is very good, because on the National Water Council, you can have all the major actors, not only at the ministerial level, the sectorial level, private sector, but at the community level, and then some key social groups such as women, youth, differently abled people, and so on, so that you have the combined intellectual capital of people to really make a difference in the process.
Thank you, Paulette. Well said. Yes, please.
I think your question reminds me of one of the challenges we face as an aid agency, which is that 95 to 99% of our funding is earmarked. And in some cases, it's very, very narrowly restricted. And global health is a perfect example. We have a disease-based approach to responding to global health problems. So our funding is tied to ensuring proximate impacts on diseases such as tuberculosis or HIV/AIDS. Instead of taking a more macroscopic look at primary healthcare systems and how we avoid getting to the scenarios in which we face these diseases in the first place. Now, one of the things I've been thinking about as we think about how we institutionalize our priorities at USAID is, where do we have flexibility that we're not affording ourselves? Where do our own internal guidelines overly restrict our capability to think more macroscopically in the way you're describing. And I do believe our global health guidelines are actually more restrictive than what Congress has already indicated. We need to maintain fealty to congressional intent, and at the same time, we need to be making the most strategic use of very limited public resources. And the health implications of the water crisis and of the climate crisis writ large are so substantial, which is why our health team is now looking at how we can expand our famine early warning system to include a pandemic early warning system, because we're going to see, sadly, more and more pandemics in the context of the climate crisis.
Thank you, Gillian. Chris, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything on this point.
Very quickly, it really challenges us, for example, at the regional level to take the many multiple national priorities that are associated with water and then to design and to seek donor support for the intervention. So I think part of the response is how we design our projects, our programs, the work that we want to get assistance to. It's, I think, a better understanding of the donor framework that exists. The reality is donors are not going to fund everything that you want to do associated, let's say, with health and water. But it comes down to how you are able to present a proposal that is then more cohesive, that whether or not you're approaching it from a human health, environmental health, coastal zone perspective, it's all towards a common national goal, vision, and then at the regional level, a common regional goal and vision that allows you then to pick out that your intervention in a sector is then going to have spin-off benefits for other sectors. So how we design and seek out those types of assistance, I think, is also going to be key. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Lots I could say about proposal writing that I will not say. So we have another question. I noted Mr. Corbyn's last comments about the energy costs, i.e. water. Are these costs for distribution of water? Don't the reservoirs owned by the water authorities have the potential to generate hydro energy to distribute water? I think in Grenada, the GIZ is working with the GOG in realizing this. So they're trying to understand what really are some of the issues with energy costs regarding water, and is it mostly distribution? Is it other elements? What is it we're talking about? And I note that we've got 2 minutes left, so I need to kind of wrap up.
I think they're very eminent water utility managers in this room who could probably answer that a lot better than we can. But very quickly, of course, it relates to source, distribution, in some cases, topography. Is there potential? I would say yes. Have we analyzed the potential fully? I'm not sure. Maybe there's more to be done there. So just a quick reaction that I think there are opportunities, but there are also real costs in terms of where we abstracting the water from and where we have to carry the water to. Potential for solar, as an example, that we could also look at in terms of the pumping of water from one area to another. Over.
Thank you, Chris. So let me wrap up. And while I'm wrapping up, I encourage you to complete the end of session poll. Give us your feedback on this session. I want to thank our panelists. I think we were able to explore a number of issues of the nexus between climate, water, and ecosystems. The need for not just sectoral, but really a more holistic approach, really looking at, I think Paulette says it's best, what are the drivers and the pressures? And those are two different things, by the way. What is the current state and trends? What are the impacts that are really concerning us? And therefore, what should the response be? Even though it's one word, the idea is that the response comes after you've done the other things. And so really, we are going to need to put our best foot forward. But I'd also say that perhaps we need to engage better with the people themselves who are using and relying on the water to really tell us, well, what are the difficulties that they have? What are they willing to do? As Gillian says, communities are willing to contribute, but you need to tell them what they'll be getting and how much they're contributing. Thank you. Alicia, back over to you.
Thank you so very much, Lisa. Thank you to our panel. Now it's the funnest time of day. We are breaking for lunch. Unfortunately, to our virtual attendees, we would have loved to have provided you with lunch, but the AI has not evolved to that level as yet. So we will see our virtual attendees after lunch. To our attendees who are in the room, yes, I am super excited. It's lunchtime. We will be dining in the Tiffany dining room, and there will be ushers because I am very West Indian, which means I cannot give directions properly. Okay? So we're going to go out through the doors, back through the main entrance of this building. You are going to go outside of the building, round the bend, right? Oh no, you see, I have somebody in my ear done telling me I get in your lost already. What we're going to do is it's one of my personalities. So, I'm listening to her. There are ushers. The point is you're going to the Tiffany dining room, okay? Which dining room are you going to?
Tiffany.
Are you sure?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So apparently you're remaining in the building here. I'm sending you outside of the building. I'm really sorry about that. But just go back to the registration area. Somebody who is a lot more qualified to give you directions will give you directions. Okay? Just tell them you're looking for the Tiffany dining room. We will be back here after lunch. We do start our session at um are we starting at what time? 2 p.m.? Can't be 2 p.m. No, can't be 2 p.m.
3 p.m.
At 3 p.m. So we need to be back here by 1:55. By 1:55, we need to be
2:55.
at 2:55, sorry. At 2:50. This is what happens when all my personalities start talking in my head at the same time, right? So 2:55, we need to be back here. That means you need to leave the dining area in enough time to get back here for 2:55, where we are going to have a very special presentation. And I'm going to hand over to Amy Henson when we get back from lunch. We have a very special demonstration. You don't want to miss this. So enjoy your lunch. Chef Craig, please stay in the room. I do apologize for not being coherent right now. There's a lot of people talking in my head right now. All right, thank you also very much. And I really do hope you enjoyed the morning session. Enjoy your lunch, and we will see at 1:55. Thank you so very much. 2:55. Thank you to our panel.
Thank you.